The land of Egypt, a short Dvar Torah for Parashat Miketz. Where was Yosef taken after he was sold into slavery? If you answered Egypt, you're correct. Yosef was taken down to Egypt. That's what it says in the Psukim. But what does Pharaoh place Yosef in charge of? If again you answer over Egypt, I would have to deduct points for an incomplete answer. Pharaoh puts Yosef over all of the land of Egypt. What's the difference? I'm glad you asked. A quick skim through the story of Yosef in Parashat Miketz shows that when the country located southwest of Canaan is described from an Egyptian perspective, it's referred to the land of Egypt, Eretz Mitzrayim, whereas the very same plot of land from an Israelite viewpoint is simply called Egypt, Mitzrayim. Before I'm accused of nitpicking, allow me to demonstrate this phenomenon in the verses themselves. When Pharaoh describes his dream to Yosef, he says he has not seen such emaciated cows in all the land of Egypt, Eretz Mitzrayim. Yosef understands where he is and will describe a great famine over all the land of Egypt. The famine will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. A discerning and wise man should be appointed over the land of Egypt to stock up the land of Egypt in preparation for the 7 years of famine that will occur in the land of Egypt. Pharaoh placed Yosef over the land of Egypt, and without Yosef's approval, no one was to lift a hand or foot in the entire land of Egypt. Yosef tzafnat pa'amach went out over the land of Egypt before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, over the land of Egypt. And food from the land of Egypt was gathered during the years of plenty. The 7 years of abundance in the land of Egypt ended, and the famine years began in all lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. The entire land of Egypt hungered because the famine was strengthened over the land of Egypt. There are minor deviations, such as magicians of Egypt, Pharaoh king of Egypt, and Pharaoh telling the Egyptians to go to Yosef for food, but I understand those as referring to the Egyptian people, the Egyptian magician, for example, rather than the country itself. When the camera leaves the Egyptians and focuses on Yaakov's family, two things happen. A, naturally, there's much less reference made to the Egyptian kingdom, right? 17 times in Bereshit Mem Aleph, and only 5 times in Bereshit Mem Bet until Mem Daled. And B, in all 5 of those instances, it speaks only of Egypt, Mitzrayim, not Eretz Mitzrayim, the land of Egypt. Yaakov sees there's grain available in Egypt. He says to his sons that he heard that there is grain in Egypt. The brothers go down to procure grain from Egypt. They complete the grain they brought from Egypt, and they go back down to Egypt and stand before Yosef. I can refer to other places in Tanakh where there are differences between Mitzrayim and Eretz Mitzrayim, but I'll refrain for 3 main reasons. 1, Mitzrayim is mentioned hundreds of times in Tanakh, and I risk losing a reader or 2 along the way. 2, different biblical stories have different characteristics. A term can appear across various narratives with different literary intent. Or 3, sometimes in order to take note of a phenomenon, you need to see it where it is most striking. We can later examine if it's relevant in more subtle settings as well. To test whether this norm applies when referring to lands in general, I also checked other major surrounding nations and saw that Edom is sometimes called Edom and sometimes the land of Edom. Assyria is sometimes Assyria and sometimes the land of Ashur, and the same goes for Moab, Ammon, and Bavel. However, none of them seem to have this specific characteristic. None of them are adamantly Eretz Mitzrayim when speaking from the perspective of the people in the land, and adamantly Mitzrayim from those who are not. The exception is the land of Canaan, which until the book of Yoshua is always called the land of Canaan, but given that according to scripture it does not actually belong to the Canaanites, and there needs to be a distinction between its inhabitants and the place itself, it did not surprise me so much. So after convincing ourselves, or at least myself, that there's an anomalous phenomenon at play here, the time has come to attempt to understand its purpose. Despite searching, I did not find any commentators who address this topic. Reference would be gladly welcomed, and which leaves us, or you, to my mercy. I have 2 thoughts in the matter, which may actually be one and the same. It seems to me the Egyptian geography encourages the Egyptian perspective, tying the Egyptian nation strongly to its land. The land of Egypt quickly becomes the seat of the greatest ancient superpower in the world, thanks in large to the uniqueness of its geography. The Nile enables spectacular economic success, the sea and the desert provide protection from enemies, Egypt swiftly becomes the empire with a capital E. It is unsurprising, therefore, that the average Egyptian struggles to separate himself from his country. Without it, the Egyptian would not have amounted to what he did, and the distance from here to a pretentious conception is not far off. Egypt becomes, alongside Israel and Amalek, one of three nations vying over the title first, or chief, Reshit, the chief of the nations of Ham. In the words of Yechezkel, Ali Ori Vani Asitini, the Nile is my own and I have made myself. Just as Rome will not be mentioned without the coveted title, the empire, so too will Egypt not be mentioned without the word land. But Egypt's self-perception is not always reflected in the eyes of the rest of the world, and the Torah depicts matters ironically. When the famine spreads and intensifies throughout the land of Egypt, Eretz Mitzrayim, all the earth, Kol Haaretz, comes to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, for sustenance. Egypt, Mitzrayim, only Egypt. It does not merit the coveted land mentioning. May this be in memory of my beloved and courageous student Amichai Shimon ben Batya and Ishai Rubin, Hashem Mikom Davo, Dovi Hotz, Echad Sheohev Tanakh.